Stop me if you've heard this one before, but looks like James Harden wants to leave his current basketball team. Okay, there's a little bit more nuance to it than that, but essentially that's some of the rumors that are going around right now, is that James Harden would actively look at, for example, going back to Houston this upcoming offseason as a free agent. And there's a lot to talk about here, but the first thing I want to know, I want you guys to leave it down in the comment section below. What was your first reaction when you saw some of these rumors? Because mine was, man, this guy is going to have a weird career. Like, we're going to look back on the career of James Harden and wonder what we even witnessed. I mean, going from where he was in Oklahoma City as an incredible player, young player, we didn't really know kind of what his ceiling was. Contract dispute ends up with him in Houston. He becomes an MVP caliber player, which is not what really anybody thought that he would become. Great years there, really part of an offensive revolution in many ways in this heliocentric style of basketball, where it's like our most efficient thing to do every time down the floor is to have our best player have the ball. And that's what Houston did. And then you have the trade request. He ends up in Brooklyn. Then now he ends up in Philly. And now we have rumors about his impending free agency this offseason. And it's certainly weirdly timed given that Philadelphia's playing better. They're getting healthier. And if fully healthy, if they continue to play this way, they're title contenders, especially if they continue to guard this well. They're going to be a really tough playoff team because of how well they get to the free throw line and all these different things. And so it's definitely a little bit weird when you're like, wait, why are we talking about James Harden free agency right now? This is a guy that's been on, this, if he went to Houston, it would be like his fourth team in 2.5 years between Houston, Brooklyn, Philly, and then back to Houston again, or if he went to a different team in free agency. But really to me, this goes back to this past offseason, because after Philly made the James Harden trade, immediately after, things looked really good. He looked, like he was well rested. He looked like Houston James Harden in certain ways. And then things fell apart for them down the end of the season. And he was a very interesting free agent to try and figure out. And ultimately they came to, a compromise where he got a good amount of money, but not the max. And he took a significant pay cut, with the idea being that he would be a free agent this upcoming offseason. And if he played better and was healthier and all these different things, and they play well in the postseason, then he would get the long-term contract. But the problem for that, if you're Philadelphia, is if things do fall apart, which seems to always kind of be the case with these James Harden teams, does he start to look elsewhere? This has never been a super great fit between him and Embiid to this point. They haven't had a ton of reps together. It hasn't been something that has been seamless. It's not aesthetically pleasing necessarily to watch Philadelphia on a night-to-night basis, especially offensively. And Harden has been a guy that has been known to kind of rub some of his teammates the wrong way in terms of some of his habits, as we've seen specifically in Brooklyn, and of course wanting to move then to Philly and potentially back to Houston this offseason. But there's another part of this that I think really needs to be understood, and it needs to be understood every single time you see a free agency rumor, a trade rumor, whatever the case may be. Not every rumor, not every report we get is 100% true. Some of them are either completely fake or are just small pieces of the truth that are being kind of sent out there and leaked out there in small bits. And the reason to do that is because there's an agenda behind it and someone benefits from it. And who do you think would benefit most from Philadelphia being concerned about losing James Harden in free agency to the team that has the most salary cap space in the league that he also has connections to in Houston? Yeah, that would be James Harden. If he wants to push himself to a situation where Philadelphia or another team has to give him a max, then letting Philadelphia and these other teams know that he has suitors, he has options, that he would be willing to return to Houston this upcoming offseason as a free agent, is a fantastic way to get a full max from Philadelphia or another team, whether it be Houston or otherwise. And that is a different situation than what he had this past offseason, not only because of his performance and because of his age and because of his injury issues and people not knowing if James Harden was a guy they should be investing a full max in, but also teams weren't really prepared for big free agency spending last offseason. It wasn't a big part of the equation. There weren't a ton of teams that were really able to kind of make a move. And that in part was one of the big reasons that not only did it make sense for Philadelphia to retain Harden and after, moving on from Simmons and all these different things, but also made sense for Harden to return to Philly to become a free agent this upcoming offseason, even if it did require him to take a pay cut this year. Now, that's not to say that the Houston rumors are completely unfounded. I fully believe that there's a scenario here, however small percentage chance it is, where James Harden does end up as a Houston Rocket again this past offseason. I mean, there's plenty of stuff to like there. It's a young team. It's a team that is rebuilt, certainly in terms of assets, since he left. And it would be a weird situation. We've never seen a player do this, where you return to the team that traded you away so quickly that you still get to benefit from the pieces that they got in return for trading you away. Obviously, he had a good relationship with the organization in Houston. They just stopped being competitive really at a certain point, kind of missed their chance to win a title there. And ultimately, that's why he wanted to move on. I fully believe that maybe the lifestyle in Houston is something that is attractive to James Harden, and ultimately, like, I think they're a real free agency destination. And in any scenario in which Philadelphia disappoints in the postseason, or Harden and Embiid struggle to kind of combine their talents on the floor, or the vibes just aren't right, I think not just Houston, I think there's a variety of scenarios that James Harden could possibly look at this offseason. And I think those scenarios would be more numerous this offseason than they were last, because teams are just gonna be more prepared to spend. But there's a couple of things that need to happen before we get there. One, Harden has to be healthy and he has to look good, especially in the postseason, because we're at the point, given the fact that he took a pay cut this past offseason, where like he kind of has to prove that he's worth a max contract, specifically as a postseason player. And if he as well as Philadelphia fall on their face in the postseason once again, it's not really going to be that much of a conversation. Houston certainly could still be an attractive destination to Harden, but for them to suddenly be spending $40 million a year on someone like James Harden when the rest of their team isn't really quite ready to compete, and he could just get in the way of everybody else, that's certainly a question mark, and I'm not sure that's something that they would be willing to do. And more than anything, I think you have to understand that there's agendas and there's reasons why things like this get leaked. I think for one thing, the first time that we heard about it was on Christmas Day, and Philly was playing on Christmas Day, and ESPN wanted to get people to the network to hear Woj talk about James Harden free agency rumors, and then maybe they watch Christmas Day basketball the rest of the day. I think there's an agenda there. And then, like I said, in terms of leveraging and negotiating a max free agency contract for Harden, I think there's plenty of incentive there, because even as much as, you and I and everybody else can look at this and think, well, this guy's making plenty of money, like the pay cut wasn't that big of a deal, it's still something where he's going to look at it and say, I want to get as much money as I can. And ideally, if he enjoys his time in Philly and they're successful, that for him would be in Philadelphia. But this would not be the first time that we've seen Philly lose a player like this. I mean, the Jimmy Butler experience in Philadelphia, with the exception of losing to Kawhi in the crazy Game 7, things went pretty well. And I think Jimmy Butler was a pretty good fit there. He wasn't a fan of the coaching staff, certainly maybe some parts of the organization, but on the court, things fit pretty well. And they ended up losing him for basically nothing, because they got Josh Richardson back, and that certainly didn't do anything for them down the road. And it's one of those things where, like, there's a history of this. The Sixers in general are one of the more dramatic franchises in the league in terms of changes from off season to off season. And as much as I think that it is kind of an agenda-based thing, I also think this is a very real possibility. And there is also something else that needs to be addressed here. If you're Houston, whether a Houston fan watching this video or someone that just has a good idea of what's happening around the league, is this really a good idea? Like, even if James Harden looks good down the stretch, maybe plays well in the postseason, is it really a good idea for this to be your free agent, spending choice here? Is this a guy that you want to bring into your young core? Is he just going to get in the way of these other players? Is that contract going to limit what you can do into the future? And are you close enough to justify bringing in someone like James Harden with the talent that you have on your roster? Are you close enough to being, a high-level playoff team once you would add James Harden if he was interested? I'm not sure that that's the case. And I think that is the really interesting part of all this, is whether the rumor is true or not. It's an interesting thought experiment on if Harden's going to be worth a max this offseason, how their postseason run goes, and then if Houston or other teams around the league are willing to bring him in, and then specifically to Houston, what that would change for their team, and if it would even be a good idea in the first place. And honestly, like, if there was one player in the entire league that would potentially do this and jump to all these different teams in such a short time span, I do think it would be Harden. I mean, he just kind of set that precedent where he doesn't last very long in one place, and it's always a very tenuous situation with him there. And especially considering that he did take the pay cut to return to Philly, and again, it's never necessarily been a seamless fit. This would be a guy that I think could actually make this happen, but it really all depends on the playoffs. I mean, if Philly makes the finals or they make the conference finals, I can't really see a scenario in which Harden leaves. But if Philly's not willing to give out that max, and maybe Houston is, or maybe some of these other teams around the league, that could be really interesting and really intriguing. And I would also wonder, like, if Harden does end up going back to Houston, would the NBA look at that and say, wait, this can't be a thing? Like, you can't request a trade from a team, then get traded by them, and then 2-3 years later sign back with that team for a max because they have all this cap space because they're not trying to contend anymore because you wanted to leave, and then end up in a situation where you benefit from having all the assets that the team traded away in order to get you in the first, or in order to get rid of you in the first place because you requested a trade. That can't really be a thing. Like, you can't be so temperamental and so indecisive that you request a trade from one team, then you request a trade from another, then you move on in free agency from the third team back to the initial team, all in a span of 3 years, and reap the benefits of what the team got in exchange for trade. That can't really be a thing. but you never really know in the modern NBA anymore. We've got rumors flying around about the possibility that Trae Young might be unhappy in Atlanta. We've got always Bradley Beal rumors. Like this is the next step in the evolution of the player movement era in the NBA, and it just nothing matters. Like everybody's on a 1 to 2 to 3 year contract. Teams are always willing to move on from guys, and maybe this is just where we're at. But again, I think the underrated part of this is what Harden's value is around the league this offseason, and I don't necessarily think that it's 100% guaranteed that he's someone that is going to demand a max contract in free agency, even if there are teams like Houston that have a ton of cap space in comparison to last offseason where a lot of teams didn't. I don't know that we're there yet. I don't know that we've reached that point with Harden where he's 100% a max contract guy, despite the fact that he has looked better since returning from injury, and Philly, of course, has played pretty well since he's returned from injury. Ultimately, it comes down to how well he plays in the postseason, but this would be an incredible story and just would add one more chapter to what has been a pretty crazy career for James Harden.